Okay, here's the list of representative heroes for today. And today is mostly the Michelangelo show, and throughout his long life he worked for several different popes, including those listed here. Julius II commissioned the Sistine Chapel from him, of course. For Leo X and Clement VII, the Medici popes, he did the new sacristy of San Lorenzo, the Medici family church in Florence.
Then for Paul III, he painted the Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel.
We'll also begin the career of Raphael and see, among other things, the paintings he did for the Papal Palace at the same time Michelangelo was painting the Sistine Chapel. We'll also hear quite a bit of music by Josquin des Prez, called the Michelangelo of Music, and others. So as we saw last time, this is where Michelangelo's father's house was, on the Via Benecorti in Florence, and it was to this house that Michelangelo returned in 1492 after the death of Lorenzo the Magnificent, who'd been letting him live in the Palazzo Medici rent-free while he was studying sculpture across the street from the Palazzo in the school set up there with Lorenzo's money under the direction of Bertoldo. Then in 1494, when the French invasion brought about the overthrow of the Medici, the 19-year-old Michelangelo, nervous about his association with the family, fled the city and wound up in Bologna. In Bologna, he met by very good luck the art-loving Cardinal Aldovrandi, who arranged for him to do 3 figures, including this angel, for the tomb of San Domenico in the church of the same name. This was an important assignment, so Michelangelo must have made quite an impression on the cardinal as a person, since he presumably had no work to show him, though he may have had some references that would explain Aldovrandi's confidence in him. The cardinal also allowed him to live in his home there. The statue of Proclus, Saint Proclus, which Michelangelo also made for the tomb, certainly has something of the intensity with which we associate Michelangelo's later work. In 1495, after the French had moved on, Michelangelo returned to Florence, but the atmosphere there under the influence of Savonarola was not conducive to art patronage. However, Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco de' Medici, about whom we heard in connection with the many commissions he gave Botticelli, had collaborated, in fact, in the overthrow of Piero de' Medici, his distant relative, and had changed his name to Lorenzo Popolano, which means something like Lorenzo for the people, a more revolutionary, politically correct name than Medici by this time. He had therefore been allowed to stay in the city, and he now gave Michelangelo a commission for a religiously correct John the Baptist, which is among Michelangelo's missing works. Popolano was short on money for such things, however, and suggested to Michelangelo that he make a Cupid and try to pass it off in Rome through a dealer he knew as an ancient work that would bring a good price. Michelangelo made the Cupid, and it was bought in Rome by none other than Cardinal Raffaele Riario, the nephew of Sixtus IV, about whom we heard briefly a couple of lectures ago. A few years ago, this statue in the French Cultural Ministry in New York received a lot of attention when it was suggested that it might be this Cupid or some other early work by Michelangelo, rather than just something from a fish pond at Versailles.
It's now in the New York Met, and most authorities do believe it is the work of Michelangelo.
Anyway, the short story of what happened next is that Riario became suspicious of the piece, and figuring that it had been likely made in Florence, he sent an agent there who pretended to be looking for a sculptor to do some work in Rome, and who in effect tricked Michelangelo into giving away the fact that he had made the Cupid. Riario got his money back from the dealer, who then resold the Cupid to Cesare Borgia. Riario, recognizing Michelangelo's talent, also apparently invited him to come to Rome now. Even though Michelangelo himself was considerably influenced by Savonarola, it's likely he took Riario up on this invitation, in part at least because he thought Rome would prove a place more friendly to artists than Florence dominated by Savonarola's Calvinism. Much of the important art produced in Rome in the 15th century was in fact the work of Florentines like Fra Angelico, Botticelli, and Ghirlandaio, but there are in fact few works of painting or sculpture produced in Rome in that century which get into the standard art history texts. In architecture, there is also little in Rome surviving from before Michelangelo's day that can really be called Renaissance. This is the courtyard of the Church of San Salvatore in Laurel by an unknown architect, and it is one of only a few genuinely 15th century Renaissance-style courtyards in the city. The Palazzo della Cancelleria has what is generally considered the finest Renaissance courtyard in Rome, and this was in fact Riario's residence as well as Michelangelo's for at least part of his first stay in Rome. The original architect's name is unknown, but Bramante, the architect of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan and the future architect of St. Peter's, may have been involved, as well as a fellow named Andrea Bregno. The Sala dei Cento Giorni, the Room of 100 Days, was painted in the 16th century here in the Palazzo della Cancelleria by Vasari, who was to become one of Michelangelo's best friends. The room gets its name from the story that the young Giorgio Vasari brought the aged Michelangelo here after the place was finished and said, "Look, Michelangelo, it took you 4 years to paint the Sistine Chapel, and I did all this in just 100 days. To which Michelangelo, glancing around at what is now considered little better than wallpaper, replied, "I believe it, Giorgio, I do believe it." Vasari probably put more paint on walls than anyone in history, but although he's a very important figure in the history of art, it's because of what he wrote, not because of what he painted. Riario had good connections among the connoisseurs of Rome, and he or some other friend introduced Michelangelo to a banker named Jacopo Gallo, who, appropriately enough, considering his name, commissioned Michelangelo to make a life-size figure of the wine god Bacchus. And this Bacchus is now in the Bargello, the National Sculpture Museum in Florence. This is Michelangelo's first full-size figure and the only thing he was ever to do with some touch of humor in it. Because of the significance of wine in the Mass, grapes were often used in the decoration of Christian art and architecture, but there seems to be no suggestion of anything but pagan classical self-indulgence in this. It's not the sort of thing he could have done in Florence in the heyday of Savonarola. This is more what the circle of classicists around Lorenzo the Magnificent might have appreciated. It's also suggested, in fact, that Michelangelo's work as a whole oscillated between the classical and the Christian. And remember, his first two universally accepted works of sculpture are the Christian Madonna of the Stairs and the classical Battle with the Centaurs. Here you can see the satyr gobbling the grapes up close. Gallo was very proud of this and apparently bragged all over Rome about it and about Michelangelo's talent. One of Gallo's friends was the French cardinal Jean Villiers, who was planning to return to France and who was looking for a sculptor to make something he could present to St. Peter's as a parting gift. Gallo told him that Michelangelo was the guy, but since the Bacchus, not exactly what the cardinal was looking for in the way of subject matter at least, was the only thing on Michelangelo's resume in Rome, he had some reservations. Gallo insisted, however, that if he had Michelangelo do something for him, it would be the finest thing in Rome. And finally, Cardinal Villiers agreed to give the 23-year-old Michelangelo the commission. And he certainly did get at least one of the finest things in Rome. This is Michelangelo's Pietà now in the so-called French chapel, the first one on the right in the new St. Peter's. And with this, Michelangelo produced a work of art that must go among those things which are unsurpassable, and he was quickly recognized as the greatest sculptor alive. It must have had the same effect on many of his fellow sculptors that Mona Lisa had on painters. It must have just made them feel like giving up. It's the only work he ever signed. His name is on the band across the Virgin's breast. Vasari says that it was originally unsigned, but that Michelangelo overheard some tourists attributing it to Cristoforo Solari, the fellow who did the tomb of Ludovico Sforza we saw last time. And that night he went into the church and carved his name right across the middle of it, producing the most prominent signature and advertisement on any work of art in the Renaissance. It is, in fact, the most virtuoso technical accomplishment he ever finished. Vasari was especially impressed by the drapery of the Virgin's gown, which, it has often been pointed out, is such as to make it impossible for her to actually walk around wearing it. But it's not meant to be a real gown any more than this is meant to be a real scene. Michelangelo was not trying to represent an event that actually happened, but rather a conception, something like resignation to the will of God. Will Durant, who calls Michelangelo the greatest artist in the history of the world, but nevertheless criticizes almost everything he did, says that the Virgin's left hand makes an inappropriate gesture. But Rolf Schott, in his book on Michelangelo, says that that hand expresses everything. And that's a gesture of resignation, of acceptance. It's also, of course, true that the Virgin looks at least no older than her son. When this was pointed out to Michelangelo, he said simply that virgins keep their beauty longer than other women, but I think he said that just to shut people up. As I said when I was talking about Leonardo's Virgin Child and St. Anne, this is not the kind of thing that should be judged by the standards we might apply to newspaper photographs. It's a stone vision that has to be consistent only with the conception it represents. We're hearing Josquin's motet, Virgo Salutafere, and we're going to hear another one now. Apropos of this subject, the Queen of Heaven, the motet is Salve Regina. Josquin was in Rome for 10 years, but left in 1496, and he may never have met Michelangelo, although Josquin, was in Italy for another 10 years or so. After finishing the Pietà, Michelangelo returned to Florence because the cathedral chapter had an 18-foot-long block of marble which it wanted to turn over to a sculptor capable of making something great of it. As we'll see, Michelangelo did get this job, which amazingly Leonardo da Vinci also wanted. But in fact, within about 4 or 5 years after his return, he was so swamped with commissions that he was committed to do around 60 life-size statues, only a handful of which were ever finished by him. The so-called Bruges Madonna, which you see now in the church of Notre Dame in Bruges, may have originally been intended for the Cathedral of Siena, but it was bought by a Flemish businessman and is now the only
universally acknowledged
finished work of sculpture entirely by Michelangelo's hand outside Italy. Here you can see it a little better. Durand says it's one of his poorer works, but Rolf Schott calls it as sublime as the Pietà. Soon after this was done then, and it was probably completed in 1501, it became common to represent the Virgin at least faintly smiling in the presence of her child, and even Fra Filippo Lippi's Uffizi Madonna we saw earlier this quarter is close to smiling, but Michelangelo hardly ever put a smile on a face in his life. And he sticks to the tradition that since the Virgin had foreknowledge of the fate of her son, she should have a serious expression on her face, and her expression here is in fact very close to her expression in the Pietà. What really brought Michelangelo back to Florence, as I said, was the block of marble that was available, and in late 1501 he began turning it into his David, a copy of which now stands where the original stood for 400 years in front of the Palazzo Vecchio. What Savonarola might have thought of this, I don't know, but he had been executed in 1498, and Florence was again a more art-friendly place. To some extent, certainly, David was meant to serve as a challenge to the Medici on both a political and on an artistic level. Lorenzo de' Medici's son Piero, who had been kicked out in 1494, was trying to return to power, and although he wasn't very Goliath-like, the implication is that Florence was as resolved as David to keep him and the Medici out. Also, I think it's likely that Piero Soderini and his Republican government wanted to make an artistic statement to the effect that they, too, like the Medici, could be art patrons and connoisseurs. One would think that Michelangelo, who had benefited considerably from Medici largesse in his youth, might have had some misgivings about the way his David was to be taken as a symbol of Republican resolution in the face of the Medici threat. But he expressed no known reservations, and, in fact, was later to risk his life in defense of the city against the Medici and their allies. Here you can see the original now in the Academy Museum in Florence at the end of the corridor, lined with some of Michelangelo's unfinished figures for the tomb of Julius II, about which we'll hear later. The consensus seems to be that the figure itself is about 13.5 feet high, although it seems to me that it is in fact taller than that. Presumably Michelangelo couldn't use the full 18-foot length of the block and keep the figure in proportion. In any case, this fellow would not have been the underdog against Goliath. He would have been the favorite. Goliath was 6 cubits in a span, which made him 10 feet 9. The Florentine precedents for this subject, those in bronze by Donatello and Verrocchio, depict David as a young and almost girlish fellow. There's a marble David by Donatello that looks more masculine, as does Del Castagno's painted version we saw earlier, but Michelangelo's is in a different class altogether. Here he is up closer now. Another thing that distinguishes Michelangelo's David from his predecessors is the fact that he is represented as facing Goliath, not just posing after the fact, kicking the monster's head around. There's no physical action here. In that way, the work is typically Renaissance, but this is not a serene lack of action. It's a tense or intense lack of it. It's the tense calm before the thundercrack. I don't know how much the Platonism of Lorenzo de' Medici's circle really affected Michelangelo or his art, but it can be claimed that this is a Platonic conception of David, in the sense that Plato held that ideally the body should reflect the state of the soul. David was a hero, and this is the body a hero should have. And here he is up still closer now. Vasari says that this is greater even than any Greek statue, and the nudity and idealized masculinity here certainly do bring Greek sculpture to mind. It's a kind of combination of Greek style and Old Testament attitude in the modern sense that we see here. This is not a Christian David. This is not someone who would turn the other cheek to an enemy. This is the David who told Goliath that he came in the name of the God of the army of Israel, that he was going to cut off his head, and that he would give the carcasses of the Philistines to the vultures and wolves, that all the earth might know that there is a God in Israel, and who went on to be celebrated for the thousands of enemies he killed as well. Outside of the face, the hand is the most expressive part of the body, and Rolf Schatz says, only somewhat hyperbolically, that this hand is the hand of a killer. When the statue was finished, it took 4 days to move it on a wheeled cart the short distance from where Michelangelo's shed was near the cathedral to the Palazzo Vecchio, and some Medici supporter threw a rock at it and knocked the middle finger off, and you can see the joint there where it was reattached. In a later emeute associated with the return of the Medici in 1529, someone threw a chair out of a window of the Palazzo Vecchio and knocked the whole left arm off, and Vasari himself apparently dragged it to safety, and it was reattached as well. Here's the massive head up close. The story goes that when it was nearly finished, Piero Soderini, the Republican gonfaloniere and soi-disant connoisseur himself, came to see it and commented that it looked just fine, but that the nose was a trifle too big. Just take a little off the nose there, Michelangelo, and it will be perfetto. Well, this fellow was paying his salary, so Michelangelo went along with him, but as he positioned his ladder, he scooped up some marble dust and chips from the floor in his hand. He then pretended to be working on the nose while allowing the dust and chips to fall, until Soderini suddenly said, "Stop right there, now you've got it, that's perfect." So Soderini had the satisfaction of thinking he was responsible for putting the finishing touch on Il Gigante. This is the Holy Family by Michelangelo, which he painted for Agnolo Doni, so it's usually called the Doni Tondo. A tondo is a round picture. While he was working on this, and before the David was finished, Michelangelo had committed himself, as we heard last time, to paint the Battle of Cascina opposite Leonardo's Battle of Anghiari on the wall of the Room of the 500 in the Palazzo Vecchio. Durand says it's lifeless and colorless, but the colors are now much brighter than they were when he saw them, because it was cleaned a few years ago. Rolf Schott calls it a miracle of sculptural drawing, and it really does look like the kind of painting one would expect a man who was a sculptor at heart to do. It could almost pass for a painting of colored statuary, I think.
This is perhaps
the only painting Michelangelo was to complete before the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And the twisting figure of the Virgin certainly reminds me of the look of the figures there. It should be pointed out that this is a tempera picture. Michelangelo had no use for the newfangled oil medium, which he said was for women and lazy painters. He was no friend of Leonardo's. But now, what sort of place have Joseph and Mary taken the baby Jesus to here anyway? Why are all these naked men lolling around in the back? There's no biblical or traditional explanation for this. I think the real explanation is simply that Michelangelo considered them to be decorative in the way another painter might have considered flowers to be decorative. But Michelangelo never painted a flower in his entire career, and probably had less interest in landscape than maybe even Botticelli. When he thinks of decoration, he thinks of the male nude, here and as we'll see on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. No great artist since classical antiquity had been so devoted to the idealized male body. Pope Julius II's tomb was meant to have 40 nude men sprawled all over it. And speaking of Julius II, this is a sketch of how St. Peter's looked when he became Pope in 1503. This was essentially still the church that was built in the 4th century, though with a 13th century facade and mosaics. It was much in need of repair, however, and Julius II just decided to rebuild the whole thing, in part because it wasn't suitable enough for the colossal tomb he wanted. Bramante was chosen to be the architect of the new church, and Michelangelo was commanded to give up all his Florentine projects and come to Rome to make the tomb, which was to stand 40 feet high directly under the dome. Michelangelo arrived in Rome in 1505, and for the next 8 years, his relationship with Julius was to be one of the most interesting artist-patron associations in history. They were two of the most strong-willed people of an age of strong-willed people. No one ever expected more of genius than Julius expected from Michelangelo, and no genius ever accepted and answered such a challenge with a more complete victory. This is Julius now, and a detail from one of Raphael's frescoes we'll hear more about later. He was not called the warrior pope for nothing. He had been the enemy of the Borgias, but he had the same political ambition, the unification of Italy. Michelangelo was given money to get marble and begin work, but then the Pope seemed to lose interest. He was busy planning military and political business, but it's also likely that Bramante's jealousy of Michelangelo was a factor, and Bramante had a lot of influence with Julius. In any case, Michelangelo felt that he was not being treated the way he deserved, and in 1506 he went back to Florence in a huff, which made Julius furious. Threatening letters to Michelangelo and to the government of Florence as well were fired off to no effect. But in August of that year, after his army occupied Bologna, which had been reluctant to see things his way, he was in a better mood and sent a more conciliatory request for Michelangelo to join him there, which he did, encouraged by the Florentine Gonfaloniere Soderini, who was worried about the consequences of the Pope's continued enmity. All was forgiven, and Michelangelo was commissioned to make a 12-foot-high statue of Julius in bronze, a medium in which he had never worked, but it was hardly an assignment he could turn down.
I say a medium in which he had never worked, but the Fitzwilliam Museum at Cambridge owns 2 bronze figures of men riding on lions that many think are the work of Michelangelo either before or after the statue of Julius was made. One suggestive piece of evidence for the attribution is a drawing, this drawing made by one of his pupils. This is a sketch made by Baccio Bandinelli of the statue of Julius as it once looked.
The story goes that when Michelangelo proposed to put a Bible in one of Julius's hands and to have the other raised in blessing, the Pope in effect said that wasn't his style. "Put a sword in one of my hands," he commanded, "and have me threatening the people of Bologna with the other." The statue doesn't survive. 3 years later, Julius's enemies took the city back and sold the statue to Alfonso d'Este, who had it melted and made into a cannon, which he whimsically named La Giulia, and we'll see it next time in Titian's portrait of Alfonso. By May 1508, Michelangelo was back in Rome, where Julius still showed little interest in the tomb project. Some think that Bramante had convinced him it was unlucky to have a tomb made while you were still alive, or maybe Julius just felt he wasn't going to need it for a while. In any case, Michelangelo was now put to work, very much against his will, painting the ceiling of the chapel that had been built by Julius's uncle, Sixtus IV, which we know as the Sistine Chapel. This is a close-up of a letter Michelangelo wrote to a friend of his, and I think if he'd shown this picture to Julius, he might have had second thoughts and given someone else the job. But he didn't show it to him, and Julius was adamant. You say you've never done a fresco before? That's what you said about bronze casting. Are you a genius or not? Get started. Here's the whole chapel ceiling now as it looks after the recent restoration of the 1980s and 90s. We've already heard about some of the important artists who painted the pictures on the walls, artists like Botticelli and Ghirlandaio, but their work is ignored by the tourists who come to see what should probably be called the most amazing work in the history of painting, this ceiling. Even the Last Judgment, which Michelangelo painted, as we'll see, a quarter of a century later, is hardly in the same class. Michelangelo, who had never painted a fresco before going to work on this ceiling, painted the largest and greatest one ever by a single artist. Ironically, Bramante again, a close friend of Raphael, who had just been commissioned to paint the walls of the stanza in the Papal Palace, is sometimes thought to have talked the Pope into having Michelangelo undertake this apparently hopelessly difficult task in expectation of a colossal failure that would ruin his career. If this is true, no plot ever backfired more stunningly than this. As Johann Wolfgang von Goethe says, you can have no idea of what one man can accomplish until you see the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Here's a closer look at part of it. Apparently, Julius proposed that Michelangelo paint the 12 apostles on the ceiling, but the artist counter-proposed a series of 9 central subjects from Genesis surrounded by other Old Testament heroes, pagan sibyls, and anonymous heroic nudes, and Julius gave this the okay. It is sometimes suggested that Michelangelo in effect painted Julius's tomb on the ceiling, and he certainly did use some of his ideas for the never-to-be-sculpted tomb figures and the never-to-be-built architecture here. And there is in fact very little on the ceiling except architecture and human figures, a total in fact of 343 of them. I don't want to get bogged down here in trying to define what art historians call mannerism, but the Sistine ceiling is sometimes called Mannerist because that style, about which we'll hear more when we get to Tintoretto and El Greco, the quintessential Mannerists, often involves the distortion of the human body. In Michelangelo's case, by making it sometimes almost inhumanly over-muscled, and the twisting and turning of it. I think it's fair to say that body language was more important to Michelangelo than facial expression, although that's not meant to be inconsistent with the claim that he painted some of the greatest faces ever. The recent cleaning did provoke some controversy. One fellow referred to it as the Chernobyl of restoration, and others have likened the appearance of it now to that of a giant Hallmark card. The overwhelming consensus among authorities is, however, that this is the way Michelangelo meant it to look. Nothing's been added and nothing's been taken off but dirt and fungus. The parts of his work which benefited most from the cleaning are those near the windows just below the ceiling on the sides, where the most moisture and consequently the most mold had accumulated. Here you can see one of the windows and the pre-restoration dirt and fungus still clouding the area around it. Nason, apparently the figure on the right, like many of the other figures in the decoration, is a very obscure fellow. Here's the same area now since the restoration. About the only thing Nason and the other persons named on the plaques have in common is that they are listed in the genealogy of Christ, or rather in that of Joseph, who was not, of course, Christ's biological father at all. But nowhere else in the history of Christian iconography are they given such importance just because of that. Here you can see another of the lunettes before the restoration. Another puzzling thing is that it's not clear that the names are really even supposed to identify the nearby figures. There are 3 successive kings named here, and there are only 2 figures, one of whom's a young mother. And here's that section of the work now since the cleaning. Here's one of the decorative nudes before the cleaning.
He's significantly resting on a bunch of acorns, the heraldic vegetable of the Della Rovere family to which both Julius and his uncle Sixtus, the builder of the chapel, belonged. Rovere in Italian means oak.
And here he is since the restoration.
This is the choir loft in the Sistine Chapel, and a few years before Michelangelo was working on the ceiling, Josquin de Prez was a member of the papal choir, and between the 15th and the 18th centuries, hundreds of those connected to the choir scratched their names on the walls. In 1998, Josquin's own name was found during a restoration of the place.
We're going to see some more details from the restored ceiling now and hear part of the Sanctus from Josquin de Prez's Missa, his Mass, the Missa Ave Maris Stella. Here you can see David about to cut off the head of Goliath. Prophet Daniel Zechariah Joel Asa, Jonah, Isaiah, the Libyan Sibyl. The Sibyls, you may remember, were thought to have had foreknowledge of the coming of the Savior, and so were looked upon as sort of the classical pagan equivalents to the Old Testament prophets. The Persian Sibyl. The Cumean Sibyl. The Delphic Sibyl. The creation of Eve. The creation of the sun and moon. The creation of Adam. This is the tomb of Gaston de Foix in the Castello Sforzesco in Milan. Julius died in 1513, having lived just long enough to see the ceiling completed, but he probably died happy because of that, and maybe even more because the French, whom he had resolved to drive out of Italy, were, if not actually defeated, at least forced to withdraw after the Battle of Ravenna in 1512, where their commander, Gaston de Foix, was killed. The new Pope, Leo X, was Giovanni de' Medici, the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent. Giovanni seen here with, on the left, his cousin Giulio, the illegitimate son of Lorenzo's brother Giuliano, in the Uffizi portrait of them by Raphael. That's Leo's secretary at the right. Florence had been allied with the French in the latter stages of Julius's campaigns against them, and when the French were forced to evacuate Italy, Soderini and other members of the Republican government fled, and Julius had put the Medici in the person of Giovanni here back in charge of Florence with the support of the papal army. In 1513, Giovanni went off to Rome then to succeed Julius, leaving Florence more or less in Giulio's hands. Leo was fond of all the arts and a good pope for the Renaissance, if not necessarily a good spiritual role model. On his resume, he could put that he had been abbot of Monte Cassino at 11 and a cardinal at 14, thanks to the influence of his father, Il Magnifico. And at 37, he was one of the youngest popes ever. He was still barely 40 when this portrait was painted. On taking over at the Vatican, he remarked famously, "God gave me the papacy and I intend to enjoy it." After finishing the Sistine ceiling, Michelangelo had returned to work on the figures for the now late Julius's tomb, and we see one of the unfinished figures here now on display in the Academy in Florence. Michelangelo said that the art of the sculptor consisted in liberating the figure within from its marble prison, and one certainly does get the impression in looking at some of his unfinished work that there really is a subject still struggling to get out of there. If Michelangelo had worked on one figure until it was finished, and then gone on to another, we would probably have a good many finished works. But he preferred to work a little on this one, then some on another, and so on, with the result that only really one, the Moses now in San Pietro in Vincoli, which we'll see in a minute, was probably completely finished by his own hand, among those intended for Julius's tomb anyway. Here's another in the Louvre now. Exactly what all these fellows were to represent is still argued about. They're often called slaves, and one theory is that they were to represent territories Julius conquered, but that's just an unconvincing guess. As I said when I was talking about the nude men in the Doni Tondo, I think they were just thought by Michelangelo to be appropriate decorations, like the ones we just saw on the Sistine ceiling. In any case, in 1516, Leo made Michelangelo stop work on the whole tomb project because he was quarreling with Julius's nephew, Francesco Maria
della Rovere,
who, among other things, had killed a friend of Leo's in a duel.
So he didn't want Michelangelo glorifying the della Rovere family.
The new Duke of Urbino, put in place with the backing of Leo and the papal army, was another Medici, Lorenzo, the son of Leo's older brother Piero. It was Piero, remember, who was thrown out when the French arrived in Florence back in 1494. Francesco Maria was to return to power after the death of Leo, however, and continue to badger Michelangelo for years to finish the tomb of his uncle Julius, but all that ever came of the project is now not under the dome of St. Peter's, but rather
in the della Rovere family church of San Pietro in Vincoli.
St. Peter in Chains, so called because it claims to have on display the chains which bound Peter in his Roman prison, and this is the way it looks today. And here's the nominal tomb inside the church now. Basically just sort of one end of what was to have been the whole building-sized thing, and Julius isn't even buried in the sarcophagus in the center. He's in the crypt of St. Peter's, forced to double up with his uncle Sixtus in the latter's tomb. Probably the only figure which is wholly by Michelangelo here is the celebrated Moses at the bottom center. And here he is up closer now. Durant calls him an ill-proportioned monster, but Rolf Schott says he's full of sublime energy, and that certainly seems like a better description. Goethe says, how small Sinai seems when Moses stands on it. And he could very well have been thinking of this awe-inspiring figure when he said that. Someone else says that here we have Moses become Sinai, and if ever there were a mountain of a man, this is one here. Everyone notices the horns, of course, and a lot of silly stuff has been written and said about them. Fodor's Guide to Rome says simply, without explanation, that they are satyr's horns. What in the world are we to make of that? It's true that the Hebrew word for horn and ray are homographs, but anyone who thinks that Moses came down from Sinai with horns on his head, let alone satyr's horns, rather than rays of light emanating from his head, has a lot of explaining to do.
However, it is odd that St. Jerome's Vulgate uses cornuta, which is vague in Latin, instead of radians or luceat.
Tour guides claim to be able to see portraits of everyone from Julius II to Mussolini in this most monumental of all beards, but tour guides are very imaginative people. I do myself, however, see a strong resemblance to Charlton Heston in Moses himself, which might have influenced Cecil B. DeMille. When Leo made Michelangelo stop work on the tomb, it was partly because he had other projects connected with his own family in mind. The Medici family church of San Lorenzo had never gotten a facade, and Michelangelo was now asked to return to Florence and build one on it, despite the fact that he had had no more experience as an architect than he'd had as a fresco painter when he started the Sistine ceiling. This is a sketch he made for the project, but nothing ever came of it, mostly because of various difficulties Michelangelo ran into trying to get the marble for it, bad weather, politics, and his own stubborn insistence that all the marble had to be ready before he could start. Finally, Leo called the whole thing off, and as we saw earlier this quarter, the church still has the plain brick facade it had 500 years ago. Michelangelo was to get much farther with the new sacristy for this church, however, although the sculptural decoration was never finished. It is similar in layout to Brunelleschi's so-called old sacristy on the other side of the church. It's essentially a cube-shaped building with a hemispherical sail dome on top of it.
Originally, 6 Medici were meant to be buried here, but only 2 tombs were ever even partly completed. Those for Giuliano, Duke de Nemours, who was one of the sons of Lorenzo the Magnificent, and Lorenzo the Duke of Urbino, the grandson of Lorenzo the Magnificent.
Since the Duke de Nemours had died in 1516, Michelangelo began with his tomb, which you see at the left here, and went on to that of the Duke of Urbino, Lorenzo, who died in 1519. But he never finished even these, and never even began work at all on the tombs for the more important members of the family. It's common for people to mistake the Lorenzo and Giuliano who have the partly finished tombs here for Lorenzo the Magnificent and his brother Giuliano, but they are in fact buried, these fellows, as we saw earlier this quarter, under that console at the back. Leo and Giulio, the future Pope Clement VII, are buried in Santa Maria sopra Minerva in Rome. Here's Here's the tomb of Giuliano Duke de Nemours up closer now. It's hard to believe Michelangelo meant for the figure representing the deceased to be squished into the niche he occupies, and the figures said to represent night and day look like they don't belong on the sarcophagus at all and are about to slide off. Nevertheless, there are drawings by Michelangelo that show this all pretty much looks the way he intended it to look. When it was pointed out to Michelangelo that the figure representing the Duke de Nemours here didn't in fact look anything like him, Michelangelo simply said that in 500 years no one would care. We're going to see some more of the tombs now and the new sacristy, and hear another piece of music by Josquin des Prez. This is the Gloria from the Missa Ave Maris Stella. This is the owl under Knight's leg. This is the other side of the room now, with the tomb of Lorenzo, Duke of Urbino. He was the father of Catherine de' Medici, who became Queen of France, and about whom we'll hear a lot next year. The figures on his sarcophagus are said to represent dusk and dawn. Dawn is the nominally female figure. This is dusk. And his head up close. Here's the head of Lorenzo. Again, the statue represents him. It is not a portrait. And this is the vault of the building. Okay, that's where we'll take the break.